right. Welcome to the Social Ninjas podcast. I am your co-host, Kyle. Join with me as always, the other co-host, Jeremy. What is up, Jeremy?
Hi, Kyle. Good to see you.
Very good to see you as well. Love the enthusiasm. We also have a very special guest with us today, Paul. And I'm not going to pronounce the last name because I forgot to ask you how it's pronounced.
That's okay. Whenever I start my presentations, I have a slide that it's Lopushinsky. But whenever I do my presentations or workshops, I always have a slide that shows how to pronounce it because I've heard every wrong pronunciation under the sun. So it's all good.
Lopushinsky.
Yeah.
No big deal. First try.
I did say it though. So.
Oh, man. So, Paul, can you tell us a little bit kind of about what you do and your background and stuff?
Yeah, sure. So I run a company called Playficient. So I help organizations see through the bull and really focus on what matters with the employee experience. So that could be working on, creating more playful cultures beyond just looking at what I call the kindergarten office or the ping pong tables, the classic Google style office that everyone loves to copy. Using techniques like design thinking to break down the employee experience. And I take a lot of techniques that are used on users or customers, design thinking is very commonly used for understanding your customers, or journey mapping is another thing as well. Taking those concepts and turning them internally in organizations. So it's how can you use this to improve your employees and your employee experience? Because I'm a big prospect of, making sure companies put employees first, and then they'll take care of their customers. As far as my background goes, I didn't come from usually with most people I'm talking with in this space, more human resources, people and culture. I don't come from that background. I come more from a user experience design background. So I worked as a user experience designer, but also product manager. So a lot of that was trying to find that little overlap between what people say versus what they mean, versus what they do versus what they feel, because all four can be very different. But there is that tiny overlap, and finding that overlap is what really allows you to build the best possible experiences for whatever that may be.
So my first question is, so you talk about user experience, and you talk about what you instill in companies. What are companies doing now that aren't working, and what do you instill in them that do work, and why do they work?
It's a good question. I think, for example, and this has been a real one of those benefits of COVID is I'm a big proponent of having playful workplace organizations where people can have fun in the workplace because it helps to ignite creativity, helps build relationships. The problem is there's this concept of 8 play personalities that we can all have. And most organizations really only cater to 1 or 2 of the play personalities, and one of them being competitive, because by their nature, companies are competitive, leaders are typically competitive. So that's where you end up, and as I mentioned earlier, this is where you end up with the kindergarten offices, where you get, the ping pong tables and the beer o'clock on Fridays. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just when it's the only thing organizations offer, a lot of people don't gravitate towards that. And I was lucky when I was working, I didn't have it used against me, but I've talked with people who are oh, people in performance reviews said I spent too much time at the ping pong table, or I wasn't engaging enough, in our social activities. So yeah, a lot of organizations do forced fun, which I utterly despise. So my big thing is, and that's really good about COVID, is a lot of organizations don't have the office anymore, but they've gotten creative and allowing employees to kind of, in a lot of ways, take charge and saying, hey, maybe I'll do a Zoom cooking class, or a Zoom lunch and learn, or a Zoom yoga class. And a lot of it starts to pop up organically, as opposed to being forced, as I mentioned, forced fun. So yeah, I think that comes from a lot of organizations, I guess it gets popularized by companies like Google and Facebook, where they're oh yeah, Google and Facebook have napping pods and rock climbing walls, therefore we need to do the same thing. And that's, to me, it's just copying at the surface level. Like you can't just look at what they do and just like try and take that DNA from them and inject it into you. You have to like companies have to find their own way. It's okay to be influenced, but like outright copying without understanding, like that never usually leads anywhere good.
Interesting. So when you talk about this designs thinking, I know when you sent me an email, something about how you can use designs thinking for anxiety and depression or something along those lines.
Yeah. Well, so design thinking, it's kind of a nebulous term, because when people hear design, they think, oh, like I have to be like a good drawer, or, you know, they think of like a phone or something, like how it looks, like the total package. But design, what design thinking really is, it's like a problem solving framework, of really breaking down. It's like, you know, a human centric approach, and coming up with multiple solutions quickly and testing them out. So it's like an iterative process, and it's typically associated with the business world, right? Where, you know, a lot of organizations will use this framework to understand where customers are coming from, really break down like the problems customers are having, and you know, try and generate solutions for that. So the concept's been around, I think, since the 1950s or 60s. And it kind of became more popular the last 20, 30 years, more in the workplace. But it's that problem solving framework can be used really for anything. So yeah, for example, with depression and anxiety, you could make use of it to, you know, for yourself, being the end user. If you're doing it personally, breaking down like, what am I really going through right now, or where are these things coming from, but also coming up with a plan and solutions quickly, to find solutions to potentially deal with depression and anxiety.
I think you're muted, Jeremy.
Yeah, my Jerry. Yeah.
My earphone thing broke, I think, because it happened yesterday. Yeah, so someone will say, hey, Paul, I'm feeling like depressed and anxious. What would your advice to them be using design theory?
So I think, even without, I think first thing would be like, go see a therapist. So like design thinking is like the framework has like 5 steps to it. So the first one is empathize, really. And you typically, with design thinking, the most common approach is using it for someone else. But if you're using it for yourself internally, I think a lot of it comes down to empathizing for yourself and realizing, it's like AA, right? Where the first step of the 12 steps is like admitting you have a problem. I think with this, like, to empathize with yourself is to first acknowledge to yourself, it's like, you know what, I'm dealing with bad anxiety or bad depression. And this is something I've dealt with myself personally for the last decade, give or take. And about a couple of months ago, it really started to hit me. COVID influence for sure, because it's been harder to do some of the stuff that I was doing before to help keep anxiety and depression at bay. So that first step was kind of really acknowledging that's like, okay, I need to get help again, because I've realized I've kind of taken my foot off. What I like to say is I've taken my foot off the gas pedal, where I do a lot of things to help, you know, keep depression, anxiety at bay. And then after a while, I do fine. It's like, oh, you know what? All these things I was doing before, I don't need to do them as much. And then, I mean, COVID did play a part in making some of those things, especially socially, difficult or impossible. But it kind of came crawling back. And I think that first thing really to acknowledge is realizing it's okay. I mean, with everything that's going on with COVID and people being more isolated, like, it's okay to empathize with yourself and admit that it's like, you know, something's not right here, and I need to address it.
So what are some of those things that you're talking about that you do to, you know, keep your anxiety, depression at bay, and keep your mental health at an optimal level?
Sure. Yeah. So more and stuff that could be done personally. It's more like, eating well, sleeping, meditation, exercise, cold showers, which could be a nice way to wake you up in the morning. But it was more on the social side where, for example, I do acro yoga, which is like group acrobatics. If you ever see people in the park doing that, that's probably acro yoga. So it's a very social activity. And of course, when you're holding other people up, especially with COVID, that's a big no-no, right? So um, that was a big part of my social circle that got pushed away. A lot of reading. I play like a lot of board games and tabletop role-playing games with friends. We did that to an extent. Like we played a lot of Jackbox over Zoom, which was pretty good, but not the extent of being like there in person with them. But also I think my big thing was, so I was doing pretty good at the beginning of COVID. Like I wasn't going to my therapist as much, which has now turned to Zoom calls. Yeah, and not really talking to family and friends as much, which I've greatly improved since then. But those kind of things kind of went to the background, and then before I know it, that bleeds into other things where maybe I'm not exercising as much, or I'm not exercising at all this week, and I'm ordering more takeout food or getting more junk food, and I'm not being as active. And before I know it, that creates that cycle where depression comes back. And for people who haven't gone through it, I always find the best analogy is like, it's like wearing a lead jacket, right? Where it just kind of weighs you down. And stuff that's, doing dishes, which is such a mundane chore, feels like such an exhausting effort to do. So yeah, a lot of it was some of the more social aspects, but then that started to bleed into other things that I stopped doing.
So, were you gonna say something, Jeremy? No, your mic's not working. Okay. So, how do you get yourself back on the horse? I mean, I've experienced a lot of the things that you're talking about. Like I'll be on my game, and then for whatever reason, some event happens, whether that's something as serious as COVID or some just kind of personal matter, and it kind of knocks you off. I just want to know kind of what your suggestions would be, or things that you do to kind of like slowly creep yourself back on that horse and keep going.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I go through periods where, like, with a therapist who I've almost been seeing now for, I guess, almost 3 years now, there'll be periods where I don't go as much because it's like, oh, I'm doing fine and whatnot. But as I mentioned earlier, I use this expression of taking my foot off the gas pedal, where I always get, a lot of times I get into trouble is when things are going really well. I'm like, oh, I don't need to go as much to therapy, or, I don't have to do XYZ activity so much anymore. And then before I know it, some of that depression, anxiety comes back in. So what was the good thing? One of those benefits about COVID is, well, one, I went and did more therapy with who I saw on a regular basis over Zoom, which I found actually I thought was going to be a bigger gap in quality, but no, it's not the same as being in the same room as them, but it's still, like, I found very, very beneficial. And I think a lot of it was, talking to people about, beyond just my therapist, but like talking to family, friends about it again, because depression, anxiety is kind of one of those weird things where, for at least myself personally, like, we all cope with it in different ways. And one way I do is I tend to get like very introverted, moody, and like I don't let my family or friends know that I'm like going through it. And then like I'm not talking to them as much, and it kind of creates this weird cycle, right? This vicious cycle where it's like, well, I'm not going to bother them with my burdens. I have a lot of guilt associated with placing this on other people, because it's like, oh, I'm going to be a burden to them, whatever. But I always find, of course, that's the exact opposite of what actually it is, where I do talk with them and say, like, hey, you know what, I'm like going through some like bad anxiety and depression. I need to do something about it. but also with COVID is, at least here in British Columbia, there is a lot of more free resources that popped up from the mental health association. So one of them was like there was like a guided course you could do, and a lot of this was free because it got funding from the government. So there was like kind of like a guided course of kind of getting you back on the right track. There was a group course, which I haven't done until now, where, and because of the nature of COVID, it was over Zoom. So every Tuesday, and it just wrapped up this week. So it was about 2 months, kind of hour and a half sessions in a group. I think it was about 10 of us from around the province. Just trying to like bounce back and kind of like living that good life again. And a lot of that coming down to, recognizing you have a problem or not doing so well. And here are like multiple, solutions or little steps you could take to get back on the right track.
I love what you said about, let's get closer because my microphone's not working.
Yeah.
Speaking of, that's frustrating. Anyways, I like what you said about when you think everything's fine, you stop those like habits, those like positive habits that you do. Cause I notice I do it all the time. Like, I'm like, oh, everything's so good in my life. And then I'll stop doing all those positive, morning routines, my gratitude, my meditation, and then something bad happens and then like, woof, it comes with a storm. So I think that's really something really important is to maintain those things that are healthy for you, that works for you, even when things are really great.
Yeah, I agree. That was something I was kind of thinking about as well. Like you said, I was feeling good. I don't really need to go see my therapist. And I could, relate to several things. I mean, even this week, the first 3 days, I felt pretty good, and I kind of slacked off on my typical morning routine. And, today I got back on it. So yeah, it's just kind of funny how the mind thinks like, oh no, we're good, but it's really like something we need to practice and take care of on a daily basis.
And what's actually been interesting is this time I've kept track of the days since it was early May where I'm like, okay, I need to go get help for stuff. So I feel maybe in a way that will. So I guess it's now like 64, 65 days at this point where it's like, all right, things have not like 100% better. There's been ups and downs, but at least it's kind of like it's been like 65 days or so now since I realized I need to get help with stuff. It's something I'm just like, oh, I see like people who do that who, whether that's like alcoholics or former drug addicts where it's like, oh, it's been 432 days since I last smoked. So I'm like, maybe I'll try that and see. So it helps keep me grounded and realize like, okay, like I don't want to break this streak of, 65 days of, writing about this kind of stuff.
So that's 65 days since you saw a therapist, or like?
Oh no, sorry. I think that's more when I realized like I need to go back and get more help.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that was, and it's been interesting because every once in a while, like I'll review like the notebook where I've kind of written like my journaling about it, and just seeing how stuff has changed, and a lot of stuff that's come up that maybe for a long time I didn't address in therapy. It started to address more of, but then also to see where that led. So like I said, there's been some ups and downs with it. Like it hasn't been 100% like at the beginning. It was actually a couple of weeks ago, I actually went through a pretty bad bout again where especially a lot of anxiety raised up, some panic attacks I didn't have for a long time came back. And that was one of those things, right? Where when that happened, it's just kind of felt like all bets were off. It's like, oh God, it feels like I'm back at square one. But that wasn't the case. After a few days, it took eventually getting back on the right path.
Yeah, I've felt that way as well before. Like, feeling like you're at square one, but it's I don't want to say it's easy to get back on track, but it's not as hard, or it doesn't take as long as we think it will, or at least in my opinion. That's how my experience has been.
It reminds me of just today, actually, because I was had a lot of shame on the fact that like I probably brush my teeth once a day and I don't like brush twice a day, which is like where I want to. Just like creating that like structure of like I brush every single day, I floss every single night, and just saying it out loud, it's just so powerful. Like creating that new structure like right away. Like, so I brushed my teeth this morning, so it's like I create my reality. I think it's beautiful. And another thing I thought of is that the dynamic of like meditation, and it's like there is no bad or good meditation. They're just meditation. It's just a sit, and not labeling as good or bad. I'm just setting up those structures. My question is like, how do you use what you teach in your own life?
In my own life?
Yeah.
I think as far as like on the design thinking aspect, a lot of it comes down more to the, like, so that's like, as I mentioned, there's a 5-step framework. There's like the empathize, then second step is define, just kind of defining the problem that you want to address. It's kind of like, how might I, it's like a framework where it's like, how might we? So it's like, how, in this case, if it's myself, how might I, get over this anxiety and depression? But step number 3 is ideate, which is coming up with all these kind of different solutions you could do to address your depression, anxiety. So that's kind of sitting down and writing out, or even looking online is pretty easy to be like, what are some things I could do to ward off depression, anxiety? Is there new things I want to try? Is there something I haven't done as much that I should be doing again? That, and another interesting thing, I guess, about COVID is seeing some of these things that popped up. For example, I started making sourdough bread, and I know that was a fairly common thing. I've just heard about, flour sales going through the roof. So that's been, it's not like a long activity, but it is kind of I find calming activity. Or, I see neighbors or my roommates been gardening a lot more. Puzzle sales have gone through the roof. I know my parents have been together for like 40 plus years, did like their first jigsaw puzzle together. So yeah, a lot of it's just even asking what other people do. It's just kind of finding maybe something to inspire you. And more also, as I mentioned earlier, this concept of 8 play personalities. It's not like Myers-Briggs where you could have one. But with these 8 play personalities, you could gravitate toward, and it could change throughout your life. But I find that I kind of gravitate towards 2 or 3 of them. So I can look at those play personalities and be like, okay, what are other things I could do under that category? And then the next step after you ideate is, it's called prototype, which sounds kind of weird in this case, but that's more like, all right, of all these ideas I've come up with of things I could do to help ward off anxiety and depression. Like, what are the things I want to focus on? And then, do those, whatever that may be. And then afterwards, testing it and seeing like, okay, how much better do I feel? Do I enjoy making sourdough bread, or do I want to replace it with something else? And then that's where the process, you could iterate again, where it's like, okay, I love this activity. It's been really good for my depression, anxiety, but maybe this other thing I'm doing, I don't really like. So maybe I'll replace it with something else. So it's always like it's not like a one and done thing. It's always, and I find that's a lot of case where even I've even been guilty of it when I was working with companies as a user experience designer, where it's like, all right, like we got everything we need from the customer. They love it. We don't need to do any more testing and whatnot. But it's always, the key thing is always to keep looping and seeing what are ways I can improve this, even if it's just little tiny things. And even there could be periods where it's like, this is perfectly fine. But maybe after a period of time, you might be finding like, oh, maybe meditation isn't doing as much for me. Or, oh, maybe this gardening activity isn't doing so much for me anymore. It's kind of reevaluating why that's the case, but also it's like, okay, if that's the case, what else can I do instead?
Yeah, basically just always constantly progressing. I mean, there's always room to grow. That leads me to the question that we ask all our guests, and that is, if you had the ability to send one message to everyone in the world, what would it be?
One message. I think it doesn't matter like what kind of situation you come from. Like, don't be afraid to ask for help. Um, I guess for some context, like sometimes I feel guilt around my anxiety, depression, because it's like, you hear about people who have, bad childhoods, or maybe they had some traumatic event happen to them. They're into drugs and alcohol, and it's like they do fine. It's like, oh, someone like me who had a good upbringing, was raised well, had good parents, good family, whatnot. It's like, what should I feel bad about, um, and that's good, because we all cope in different ways, right? Like some people cope with overwork, some people cope with retail therapy, drugs and alcohol. I cope more by getting more like really introverted and not really talking with other people. But I mean, if something's feeling off inside, like it doesn't matter like on the outside, like how good you look with success and whatnot. And, you hear a lot of these stories, especially with social media, uh, with like famous YouTubers or social media figures where they're dealing with depression, anxiety. And people are like, well, what do you have to look at the job you have? Like, you should be fine. But it's like, well, there are things like you don't see that, of course, that social media projection, right? Like, oh, everything's perfect. So I think, because I struggle with it as well. It's like, if you're not feeling well and you think you need help, even though you might not feel like you deserve it, it's like, no, it's still okay. As I mentioned, like we all come from different backgrounds and from different upbringings, but even if you had like a more, like me, like a typical quote unquote, like normal upbringing, like if things feel wrong, like you shouldn't feel bad about that. If things are internally like gnawing away at you. So don't ever feel guilty about getting help. I'd say no matter like what kind of situation you come from, where you're currently at, because there's that perception on the outside that it's like, oh, of course they're doing so well, and then they were a wreck on the inside. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's
Yeah, I like that a lot. I can relate to that a lot as well. I've felt guilty numerous times, even to present day, where it's, I'll feel guilty, asking somebody for help, like it's a inconvenience. And sometimes I'll try to push my head, like, oh, I can just do this on my own. I don't want to, inconvenience that person or whatever it may be. But more times than not, it's not an inconvenience to people. People generally, in my opinion, are nice, kind people and want to help other people out, especially if they've gone through the same sort of thing that you're going through right now.
One of the things I picked up from this course was because we could always be so irrational with ourselves when we're dealing with anxiety and depression. It's like, would you treat a best friend the same way? Like, it's like, no. Like, if the way you treat yourself in those situations, like if you had a friend who's dealing with depression, anxiety, like you're going to help them. And that kind of advice you should be giving yourself, but it's tough to do. Sorry, excuse me.
So if people want to follow you or find you on the interwebs, where can they go?
Yeah. Best place would be my website for my company, Playficient, which is PLAYFICIENT.com. So it's combined the word play and proficient. Twitter, I don't do a ton of, but it's Paul Playficient. LinkedIn, usually like with my stuff, just with my Playficient brand, a lot of it is mostly on LinkedIn. So if you just find me on LinkedIn, that's the best place for where I post stuff, and it goes elsewhere as well. But also on my website and my blog and my services of like where I go into much more detail. It's more about for organizations, but there are a lot of overlaps. I talked about design thinking here. I talked about the play personalities. Like I go way more into depth about those on my blog.
Awesome. We appreciate you coming on, Paul.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.